Good day. Today, Saturday, 18th November, the two conflicts in the world, the two big conflicts in the world, the one in Ukraine and the one in the Middle East, continue unabated. And from what I can see, the general consensus, the growing consensus in both the United States and to some extent in China is that the Xi-Biden summit resolved nothing in the increasingly fraught relations between the two superpowers, between China and the United States. I'm going to say briefly on the topic of the Xi-Biden talks that I don't think these talks will just be a punctuation mark. I actually, personally, would not be surprised. In fact, I even anticipate that over the next few weeks and months, we're going to see a further spiral downwards in relations. The latest talks having done absolutely nothing to change that position. Anyway, let me turn to these two big conflicts, which are the two big events that are taking place in the world. And I'm going to turn first to the conflict in Ukraine. And I'm going to say straight away that, in my opinion, the big news over the last couple of days is not what is going on the battlefield. Important, very important, though that is, rather it is what has been happening in the United States with respect to Ukraine. Congress has now voted through a package to fund the US government, and it has been signed into law by President Biden. This is despite the fact that, as I shall discuss shortly, President Biden had previously suggested that he would not sign into law the budget allocation, the budget decision in its current form. The result is that 18th November, that is to say today, the day which many people had said would be the day when the US government would face closure because of lack of funding. Well, we're not going to find ourselves in that situation any longer. But the important thing is that the spending package that has passed did not include spending allocations to supply weapon systems and economic support to either Ukraine or Israel. Now, Israel has a functioning economy. It has a relatively low debt to GDP ratio, though that is deteriorating. It has, until recently, run a trade surplus, and it is a modern, high-tech economy, and it has powerful armed forces. It has large reserves of equipment, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, aircraft, bombs, that kind of thing. It can absorb several weeks without funding and support from the United States, even in a conflict situation such as the one in which it is in today, where the cost of the war is said to be around $250 million a day. Israel can, as I said, has space to absorb that. Ukraine does not. Ukraine's economy functions entirely on the basis of financial support from the West. Everybody concedes that now. The Ukrainians do. The Europeans do. It's hardly disputed anymore. The US pays, in effect, the salaries of Ukrainian officials, including, I presume, the soldiers who are fighting on the battlefields. It supports the currency, either directly or through loans provided by the World Bank and, to some extent at least, the International Monetary Fund. It ultimately acts even as a backstop for aid from the European Union, which would be unlikely to flow to Ukraine in anything like the quantities that it does, were it not for the case that the United States has been supplying aid to Ukraine. And, of course, the United States has been Ukraine's critical arms supplier. And, of course, it is the last that is by many orders of magnitude the most important. Now, there's been much debate and discussion about weapons that have been supplied to Ukraine from other Western countries. I've noticed that arms supplies to Ukraine from Britain over the last couple of months, if one believes public announcements, have to all intents and purposes come to a stop. There's been no big public announcement of more arms packages. The Storm Shadows have been delivered, the Challenger 2 tanks have been delivered, lots of infantry fighting vehicles have been delivered, the self-propelled howitzers have been delivered, and to the extent that Britain could supply shells, they have been delivered as well. There doesn't seem to be much more of substance that Britain can provide to Ukraine. Germany continues to supply weapon systems to Ukraine, but from what I can see, the balance increasingly has been shifting towards air defense systems, and I suspect that Germany also is now running out even of air defense systems that it can send. Germany has been supplying Leopard 1 tanks and other types of lesser equipment. The Leopard 1 tanks, as I have said many times, are probably unsuitable for use on the Ukrainian battlefield with their thin armour and relatively light guns. We have not, in fact, seen them deployed on the battlefields in Ukraine, even though some have been delivered for some time now. And for the moment, at least, there is little sign of them, and one suspects that the Ukrainians are nervous about deploying tanks of this nature, which they probably realize would not survive on the battlefronts for very long. And that's about it now from the West. I mean, Italy, East European states, apparently they've run through most of what they can supply. There's reports that factories in, I believe it is the Czech Republic, have been converting remaining T-72s, modernizing them, inserting new engines, providing new electronic systems. These are old T-72s, and they're still being supplied to Ukraine. But I get the sense that even this now is basically starting to run down. So up to now, and up to recently, it has been mainly the United States, and it's the United States that has supplied the Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, that provides the satellite and reconnaissance. Of course, that continues unabated. It is the United States that also has provided 31 tanks, though President Zelensky has recently said that those 31 tanks are too few to make any actual difference on the battlefields. But the United States, above all, has been the main supplier of shells and artillery systems. And the impression that I am getting is that that supply of shells and artillery systems is now running down and will probably run down permanently. It is likely that sometime in December, or perhaps January, the United States will vote through a package of support for Ukraine. I'm absolutely certain that it will pass a package of support for Israel, but most likely it will also pass a package of support for Ukraine. It won't be anything like enough relative to what Ukraine needs, and given the actual resource realities, it's not going to assist Ukraine address its underlying problems. The European Union has all but given up hope of supplying to Ukraine the number of shells that it promised. It promised last March that it would supply Ukraine with 1 million shells. I said at the time that I thought that the intention, the plan was to send the bulk of these shells to Ukraine before Ukraine launched its offensive. It's clear that proved impossible. The United States stepped in, borrowed shells from South Korea. Those ended up, as I said they would, in Ukraine and made up the numbers. Since then, the European Union has gradually, ever so steadily, ever so gradually, come to acknowledge that it is never going to supply Ukraine with 1 million shells in 1 year, which it promised. The enormous funds that have been assigned to doing that, they've had the inevitable and predictable result of simply inflating to an extreme degree the cost of shells produced in the European Union. If you spend ever more money on something that is only in very limited supply, all that you're going to achieve is you're going to see the cost of that item which is in limited supply, but of which you are spending more and more money. All you're going to achieve is to see the cost of that item grow, and that is exactly what has happened. Now, on top of all of that, the German Constitutional Court has now issued a ruling that the German government is running an excessively high budget deficit. It must undertake cuts in spending. The German government is going to have to consider cuts in domestic spending, but I suspect that that is going to make it very, very difficult for it to continue its support packages for Ukraine. I suspect that people within the Social Democratic Party and the Liberal Democratic Party in particular, with their eye to a future election, will start to push back and say that we can't really continue to fund Ukraine to the extent that we have done, because we are now in a situation where we are transferring money to Ukraine, which our electorate would say should be better spent in Germany, given the budget cuts that are now going to be imposed. So, less funding from the European Union, no funding for the moment from the United States. The United States unlikely to be able to provide the kind of funding for Ukraine next year on anything like the scale that it did this year or in 2022. Aid for Ukraine, in effect, reducing. And incidentally, I saw a report that the US is now downscaling the level at which it is anticipating that production of shells, 155 millimeter shells, in the United States would grow. I recall that in 2024, it was expected that at some point US production of shells would grow to over 50,000. I was always skeptical about that number. I believe that it has now been quietly reduced to 38,000. That's the new target. And of course, that is nowhere near enough to meet Ukraine's needs, let alone the competing needs of the United States itself, of Israel fighting its war, though we don't know how long that will continue for, of other US allies who will no doubt also at some point be in need of shells. So this is, it seems to me, the biggest news. Gradually, inevitably, despite much kicking and screaming on the part of members of the Western Commentariat, I discussed that article by Mrs. Mironovitz in the Spectator yesterday about there was Major Eisner's comments about the West supplying to Ukraine all the weapons that it needed. As anybody who has followed this story carefully will know, the idea that weapons can be supplied to Ukraine on anything like the scale that Ukraine needs is impractical for logistical, infrastructural, industrial reasons that simply cannot be wished away. You can throw money at the problem, but as the European Union has discovered, if you do that without increasing the production base, all you're going to do is you're going to increase costs without getting more supply, and increasing the production base is very difficult and will take a long time if, of course, you continue to run a peacetime economy, which is what the United States and the European Union are doing. And, of course, those who call for the United States and the European Union to convert to wartime economies are being unrealistic as well, because American and European publics might support a conversion of the economies of their societies onto a wartime basis if they felt themselves directly threatened, if they sensed that war was coming and that they had to re-equip their armies in order to defend their countries. But that is not the perception that exists today, certainly not in the United States, about Ukraine, where support for more funding for Ukraine is dwindling away. So the Ukrainians are going to have to face the fact that they are up against an increasingly powerful Russian army, which is being supplied with all the weapons that it needs in ever-growing quantities. There was an article in Forbes by David Axe, for example, pointing out that there are more and more T-90Ms now starting to appear on the battlefronts, that numbers of modern tanks are becoming increasingly visible within the Russian armed forces, and that it's increasingly looking as if Russian production of tanks has increased to the maximum levels of the various forecasts that we've seen. In other words, that the Russians might indeed be producing 1,500 tanks, modern tanks, new tanks a month, as opposed to a mix of 1,500 new and refurbished tanks. Not a month, a year. 1,500 new tanks a year, as opposed to 1,500, a mix of 1,500 new and refurbished tanks a year. So that comes from David Axe, who's generally a strong supporter of Ukraine. He is becoming increasingly concerned that numbers of tanks, modern tanks in the Russian army, are increasing. And of course, this is true in every category of weapons. We see this in terms of drones. We see this in terms of infantry fighting vehicles. We see this in terms of artillery pieces, including more modern artillery pieces. We see this in connection with increasing deployments by the Russians of Tornado multiple rocket launch systems The Tornado is a family of multiple rocket launch systems, some of which are precision guided and therefore analogous to the HIMARS system, of which, by the way, Ukraine has only a relatively few. Anyway, we see that this juggernaut is growing in size, this Russian juggernaut is growing in size and capability almost every day. And of course, we still get the reports that the Russian recruitment continues, apparently at the rate of something like 1,500 men a day, and that the Russians look well within sight now of enlisting 420,000 new troops into their military by the end of this year. So that is the stark, bleak picture that Ukraine faces. It is being outproduced. The Russians have more men, more machines, more weapons than Ukraine can have, and the Russian economy continues at full tilt. One of the Russian banks has now done its own assessment of the state of the economy. It believes that Russia's economic growth is continuing at a very high rate despite the recent interest rate increases. It posits an overall growth rate for this whole year by the end of this year of 3.3%, which is higher than any estimate, much higher than the estimates that we saw at the start of the year. An estimate that makes the EU's earlier estimate of a 0.9 contraction this year in the Russian economy look extraordinarily, incredibly wrong. And the fact that the economy, the Russian economy, is growing at the rate of 3.3% is partly, obviously, down to higher defense spending, but it's also the case that we are seeing rapid industrial growth across more and more sectors, including sectors that service the civilian economy. Production of machine tools, for example, is surging. Mechanical engineering is growing very rapidly. The electronics industry is also growing very, very rapidly. And of course, consumer goods production is also rapidly rising. Of course, all of this high growth is coming at the price of higher inflation. But the general consensus is still that inflation will start to fall next year. Well, we'll see. But for the moment, at least, the Russian economy is growing. There are stresses. Inflation is a sign of stress in an economy. But overall, the economic picture in Russia remains strong. Real incomes continue to rise, which surely is one of the major reasons why the government's position politically is so strong. Also, President Putin looks certain to be re-elected president of Russia next year, assuming that he does decide to stand, as everyone assumes. And there doesn't seem to be any real sign of anything changing on that front for Ukraine, any weakening of the Russian position. And it has now been pointed out by several commentators that at the Biden-Xi summit meeting in San Francisco, President Xi made no commitments to the United States to reconsider or review in any way China's strategic partnership with Russia. That relationship looks extremely strong and unaffected by whatever moves towards détente China and the United States might be making to each other. And recently, at another Indian-US meeting, Indian Foreign Minister Jaishankar told the United States the same thing. India values its close relationship with the United States. It remains wary and critical of China in many respects, but the relationship between India and Russia is not for negotiation, is not up for discussion as far as the Indians are concerned. They will press on with it. Russia is a long, historic friend of India's, and the Indians are not going to do anything that will put that relationship in jeopardy. So, no reason to think that the threat, the pressure from Russia at any point is going to slacken on Ukraine, and at the same time support for Ukraine from the West is starting to slacken and dwindle away due to a mix of increasing doubts on the part of more and more people in the West that this war is going to, in the end, be successful, but also, and perhaps most importantly, because of insuperable industrial and logistical limits, which people like Alex Vashinin, Brian Beletic, I myself have been talking about ever since this war essentially began. So, where are we with the war itself? Well, there has actually been a cascade of news, and if I can start with Kherson region, with Krinky, the Russians are now dropping leaflets calling on the Ukrainian troops in Krinky to surrender. One is getting the sense that the Russians, despite Ukrainian claims to the contrary, are now putting increasing pressure on this small Ukrainian bridgehead in Krinky. They shell the bridgehead repeatedly. They launch flamethrower strikes on Krinky. They bomb Krinky. They're able to interfere increasingly, it seems, with Ukrainian communications. And I'm going to make a further guess, which is that I suspect that what the Russians are probably anticipating is that there's going to be a change in the weather soon. The Ukrainians have been able to benefit from the foggy conditions around Krinky. This is, of course, autumn, season of mists and fog. And, of course, Krinky is on a riverbank, which is famously foggy. But it could be that the Russians are expecting clearer weather, sunnier weather, brighter weather. There might be less fog, less mist, in which case the situation of the Ukrainian troops in Krinky begins to become extremely precarious indeed. And I've been saying for some days that I get the sense that the Russians think that they've got the situation in Krinky in hand, and the fact that they're now calling on the Ukrainian troops there to surrender rather reinforces that opinion. I noticed that the British Ministry of Defence, in its latest briefing, cast cold water on the prospects that the bridgehead in Krinky would result in any major change in the battlefronts. It was, in some ways, a very typical briefing by the Ministry of Defence. It said that both sides are making various efforts. It talked about this bridgehead in Krinky. It talked about Russian pressure in Avdeyevka. It repeated the age-old mantras about the Russians suffering enormous losses. So it doesn't give very much, well, it cannot give any evidence to support this in terms of, factual evidence, but anyway, that is what it said. And then it conceded that neither side, or it said that neither side is going to make any significant advances this winter. The stalemate view of the war. Now, that is almost certainly not true on the Russian side. I should say the British Ministry of Defence were very active last year in saying that Russia's winter offensive of last year had been unsuccessful. As I've repeatedly pointed out, the Russians didn't perhaps launch quite the massive offensive all across the front lines that many people, including myself, had at one time expected. In fact, they used the winter to build up their fortifications on the Zaporozhye and Donetsk front lines, the fortifications that defeated Ukraine's offensive. And they also used the time to train and build up their forces and to ramp up military production in the way that I've said. Anyway, the Russians did those things, but they did launch a very significant offensive nonetheless, and it was ultimately successful. And that was the offensive that was launched in Bakhmut, and which resulted in the capture of Bakhmut, a not insignificant or insubstantial town of 70,000 people before the war. So, just saying. But anyway, the British Ministry of Defence says that it doesn't anticipate any great changes on the front lines this year, which may not be true of the Russians, but also rather says that the British don't expect that this bridgehead in Krinky will achieve anything. So they are downplaying its significance, which is a point, I think, that has been generally overlooked. But anyway, that's Krinky. In Avdeyevka and Bakhmut especially, we're getting lots and lots of news, and it seems that the Russians are pressing on Avdeyevka, interestingly enough, from 3 different directions, 2 in the north, 1 in the south. Now, that is unusual. In previous battles, say in Bakhmut, as I remember, the Russians, the Wagner group in that particular case, sought to capture one village at a time. They weren't attacking simultaneously in too many directions at once, but apparently in Avdeyevka they are, and they think they can. They have the ability to launch an attack towards the same target from 3 axes. And that suggests that the Russian forces in Avdeyevka have no shortage of men and machines and supplies, and that this is why they're able to put pressure on the Ukrainians in multiple points at once. And it's always seemed to me that one of the reasons for the relatively slow progress, in fact, often the very slow progress, that the Russians have shown in the various advances that they have conducted is precisely this, that they've tended to attack in one place at a time, as opposed to many. And this time in Avdeyevka it's different. And I suspect that that is one amongst several of the reasons why the Battle of Avdeyevka seems to be progressing faster than many people, myself included, had anticipated. Now, it's not to suggest that the fighting in Avdeyevka is simple or going all in one direction. The Ukrainians do mount counterattacks in particular places, but overall the Russians do seem to be making steady, incremental progress along all three of the axes that they're advancing upon. So they've now pushed the Ukrainians out of this village of Stepovoye. They are not attempting themselves, apparently. The Russians are not seeking to occupy this village, which would expose them to artillery strikes by the Ukrainian forces. But they've now secured the railway line, which is the major Ukrainian fortification in this area. I discussed the article in El País a couple of days ago in which El País, the journalist from El País, spoke to a Ukrainian soldier who spoke about the defense of the railway line being absolutely critical. If the Russians gain control of the railway line and are able to consolidate along it, they can then start to send columns of armoured vehicles beyond the railway line, and that will enable them to achieve the envelopment of Avdeyevka that they're planning. And it does look as if this is indeed happening. The Russians have captured large stretches of this railway line, and they are now advancing northward up the railway line, and they are consolidating their positions along the railway line. And once they have done that, they will be in a strong position to launch further advances to the further west, closing the cauldron around Avdeyevka shut. And they're also pushing into the industrial zone to the south of Avdeyevka. This is the other axis of advance that we're seeing from there. And they also seem to be, there are lots of reports now, that they've entered this big factory, the coke plant, and the ancillary factories around it, which is just to the northwest of Avdeyevka, practically abutting Avdeyevka itself. And there are also some reports, scattered reports, that the Russians are actually now encroaching on some of the residential areas, some of the suburban residential areas, the Dacha belts or whatever it is, that make up Avdeyevka itself. So the pressure grows all the time, and the Russians seem to have all the resources they need in order to capture Avdeyevka and to do so at reasonable speed. But in some ways, even more striking than what is going on in Avdeyevka, though perhaps not quite as important, are the latest reports from Bakhmut. Now, Dima at the Military Summary Channel said that the Ukrainians have now been forced to abandon the village of Khromovo to the northwest of Bakhmut. Now, if so, that is important. Khromovo was a village which the Wagner organization never captured. It will be the first time the Russians have ever captured a village in the Bakhmut area, or at least gained control of a village in the Bakhmut area, since the Wagner organization withdrew. The first time they've advanced beyond the point which the Wagner organization reached. In fairness, Dima said that it was not so much a case of the Russians occupying Khromovo as of the Ukrainians pulling out of Khromovo. But I presume that in this case, once the Ukrainians do pull out of Khromovo, the Russians will indeed move in to occupy it. And there are also further reports that the Russians are now pushing hard on this other village beyond Khromovo, Bogdanovka, which is another village which the Wagner organization never captured, and which, if it does capture, if the Russians do capture it? Well, it will, as I said previously, result in the final full consolidation of Russian control of Bakhmut, and will enable the Russians to position themselves in a way that will enable them finally to start pushing further west towards places like Chasov Yar. Now, again, this is, well, the advance on Bogdanovka, reports about that are coming from multiple sources, but perhaps it's best not to get ahead of ourselves. It's not clear to me, for example, that Khromovo has indeed been captured, and I would expect that the Russians would need to capture Khromovo before they moved on to this other bigger village which lies beyond it. And Dima had a very interesting film on the Military Summary channel, which he showed a Russian reconnaissance group operating in the area of the southern flanks of Bakhmut, southwest of Bakhmut. And the clear implication of this film was that Andreevka, this village which the Ukrainians claim to have captured in the summer after intense fighting, it's a tiny place, by the way, but that this village of Andreevka is emphatically not under Ukrainian control. It appears to be in the grey zone. In other words, deserted. Nobody occupies it. I don't myself know whether it has ever been otherwise, but anyway, it does seem as if the Russians are able to carry out raids in this area, and that the Ukrainian lines here are also starting to fall back. So, bad news for Ukraine, very bad news from Andreevka, potentially very bad news from Bakhmut. News from other places on the front lines also suggest Russian advances, but they are less detailed, and there remains, for me at least, still a certain enigma about what it is exactly that the Russians are doing around Kupiansk and the Oskol River, for example. But anyway, the pressure is there. The Russians continue to push forward. We shall see what happens. But again, to reiterate, the big story is that even as the Russians push forward, even as they move forward towards perhaps clearing this Ukrainian bridgehead on the east bank of the Dnieper, the one at Krinky, even as they advance steadily towards their goal of capturing Avdeyevka, which, as I said, looks inevitable, even as they seem to be pushing forward hard now in the Bakhmut area, capturing more and more ground, advancing steadily there, pushing the Ukrainians back. Well, even as all of that is happening, the underlying story is of Ukraine losing support from the West, running short of ammunition. The El Pais journalist spoke about Ukrainian soldiers telling him in the Avdeyevka area that whereas in the summer, in the fighting around Bakhmut and during the summer offensive, they were firing at a rate of 150 shells, 100 to 150 shells a day. Now that has reduced to 15, and that the barrels of their guns have become so worn that the accuracy has now sharply fallen. So even as the Ukrainians face all of these problems, even as their tank fleet reduces, even as their air force has been largely shot out of the skies, every other day now, the Russians again speak about MiG-29s and other aircraft of the Ukrainian Air Force being shot down, though in fewer numbers than before, and that presumably is because there are fewer of these aircraft left to shoot down. I get the impression that as soon as a Ukrainian aircraft takes off now from a runway, it is almost immediately targeted by the Russian military, and that the pilot is fortunate if he survives. The Ukrainian pilot is fortunate if he and his aircraft survive for very long. So, overall, a steady weakening of the Ukrainian positions, and we can see that the Storm Shadows and the ATACMS failed to deliver the decisive outcome that many people expected. The Russian air defense system seems to have got on top of the threat that they pose as well. So, a bleak overall picture for Ukraine, and my overall sense, I discussed this extensively in my program yesterday, is that Western leaders, Western governments have basically washed their hands of this whole affair. That despite the talk we sometimes hear of continued support for Ukraine, Ursula von der Leyen, when she went to Kiev a few weeks ago, still spoke about supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes. The new British Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, who also visited Kiev, his first foreign trip, by the way, which I do find a little strange, but there we go. Anyway, his first foreign trip, he went to Ukraine. He again spoke the magic words, for as long as it takes. But the Time magazine article of a few weeks ago about Zelensky said that the Ukrainians hear these words. They've come to realize that they don't really carry the meaning that they appear to. The Western powers rhetorically continue to assure Ukraine of their continued support. They go through the motions of working towards Ukraine's admission into the European Union, but they understand that they've hit the limits of what they can supply. They can't realistically supply much more, and they're starting ever so quietly and ever so gently to walk away from the problem. And as for the Russians, my own view, based increasingly on what Russian officials have been saying, is that they have concluded that a military victory is the only way that this war can end, and I strongly suspect that they expect that that military victory will now include the capture of Kiev itself and the collapse of the Ukrainian government and state as we have known it. Now, before I leave this discussion of the situation in Ukraine, I'm just going to quickly say that I've had a lot of comments. I mentioned Major Reisner in passing in my program yesterday. I've received several comments about him from various people, including people with military backgrounds. They have been, shall I say, somewhat critical of Major Reisner. All I'm going to say about him is this. When he first started doing his programs back last year, I followed him quite closely. I've ceased doing so for some time. It was not I who cited him. It was this journalist who wrote that piece in The Spectator that I discussed. I think that many of his predictions have come out wrong, and the fact that he's becoming more pessimistic about the outcome of the war from a Ukrainian perspective is an interesting fact in itself, but he's not somebody any longer that I attach much weight to. So that's all I'm going to say about him, with apologies to him in case he's perhaps listening to to this program and has overheard my words. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about that. Now, there's been a lot more news about the situation in the Middle East, and here I'm afraid I think things are taking a more ominous turn again. Firstly, I'm not going to discuss in detail the fighting in Gaza. I'm getting completely contradictory accounts about what is happening. I'm receiving reports from military people who consider that the fighting in Gaza has developed overall pretty much as the Israelis intended. And I noticed that Seymour Hersh, in his latest piece, basically says the same, that in terms of the actual fighting, Israel has achieved the military outcome that it wanted. There is an alternative view, which is that serious fighting has not even actually begun, that Israeli troops have not reached Hamas's fortresses, real fortresses, and that there's been lots of movements of machines and men by Israel in places where they would expect to meet little resistance, and that the real battle has not begun and might never begin. Well, I'm not going to dwell on that today. For me, more important is the politics of this, the diplomacy that is happening. And here I repeat again the point I have continuously made, that if Hamas is able to come out of this crisis intact, however much damage it has suffered, it will be in a position to claim that it has achieved a success. And the other thing that matters is the humanitarian catastrophe that we're seeing in Gaza, which is not only massively consequential in itself, a fact we should never overlook, but which also has political consequences which are negative for the West and the United States especially, and which are not to Israel's advantage. I'm choosing my words very carefully here, as I'm sure you will all have noticed. So that is what I'm going to say about that. But there is another development which I find much more alarming, and that relates to the movements of the USS Eisenhower, the second US Navy carrier that has been deployed to the Middle East. Now, when I first heard that the Eisenhower was steaming towards the Middle East, I was seriously worried that it was being done in preparation for a potential strike on Iran. And I said that if the Eisenhower was deployed in the Red Sea or the Gulf of Hormuz, or more dangerously still in the Persian Gulf, then that would be a very, very troubling sign indeed. But for a while, it looked as if it was actually going to be deployed to the Eastern Mediterranean. And it did indeed go to the Eastern Mediterranean, and it joined the other US Navy carrier in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Gerald Ford, with its task force. And this did represent a major, a very large naval grouping, indeed, a very powerful naval grouping, but it was in the Eastern Mediterranean, within reach potentially of Iran, or so I understand, but perhaps not positioned in a place where it looked as if it was being primed to attack Iran. Now, unnoticed by me and largely unreported until the last couple of days, but only known by me yesterday as a result of an article in the Daily Telegraph, the Eisenhower has now transited, presumably through the Suez Canal, and has apparently passed through the Red Sea and is now said to be off the coast of Oman. It passed by the coast of Yemen. There was some speculation that it might, apparently there was some speculation that it might launch strikes against the Houthis in Yemen, but it never did. But it is now said to be off the coast of Oman, not far from the Straits of Hormuz. And the US Navy, unsurprisingly, is not talking about its final destination, but there are reports that the Eisenhower might indeed be deployed to the Red Sea, to the Persian Gulf itself, in which case it would be within easy reach of the major targets it might want to strike in Iran itself. It would be very well positioned to launch a major strike upon Iran. Now, bear in mind that the Eisenhower is only one very powerful US Navy asset in this area. The other is the Ohio-class submarine with its enormous capability to launch Tomahawk cruise missiles. Many have focused instead upon the fact that this particular submarine also has facilities for launching Navy SEALs, sabotage or reconnaissance parties or whatever, special forces units. But of course, if you are thinking about a strike on Iran, then the enormous cruise missile armory of this particular submarine is what you would first notice. And of course, the Eisenhower will be accompanied by its escort ships, Aegis-type destroyers, which also can carry, and apparently mostly do carry, Tomahawk cruise missiles. So altogether, an enormously powerful military force is now gathering close to Iran, of exactly the kind that you would expect if there was some plan to launch some kind of big missile strike against Iran. Now, there is one thing that argues against the theory that the United States is planning to launch a missile strike against Iran. I get the impression that at the moment, the US government and Secretary Blinken, who seems to be leading the diplomacy on behalf of the United States in the Middle East. Blinken has been on his tour of the Middle East countries. He's had interactions with various Arab leaders. He understands the sentiments of the Arab and Muslim world perhaps better than some of the other people in the administration do. And he is also, of course, the prime receiver of all of these various dissident memos that are said to be circulating within the State Department and the US government of US officials deeply alarmed by the way in which the administration has handled this crisis and who are making their own feelings clear. So I get the impression that Secretary Blinken, who, as I said, seems to be leading the diplomacy, has chosen to try to calm tensions down rather than to increase them. There continue to be clashes between the US military and Shia militias, but both sides up to this point have so far tried to keep this under some kind of control. The US has launched 3 airstrikes, air and missile strikes, against militia and Iranian Revolutionary Guard targets, but this is so far fallen well short of an all-out war, and there's not been yet any sign that the Iranians or the Hezbollah are looking to expand the war either, and it could be that there's some kind of an understanding between them and the US. So if a big missile strike against Iran is still being planned, then that is contrary to the mood music that we're seeing coming out of the Middle East, at least for the moment. But of course, as I said before, when you deploy huge military forces on this scale, when you bring them so close to your intended target, it may be that your intention is to threaten and to warn, but the very fact of the presence of those forces is a powerful temptation to the hardliners in your midst to use these forces to launch the attack that they probably want and even hanker for. And of course, the deployment of these forces is a source of alarm to the other side, which must wonder what the intention behind these deployments actually is, and which will be taking precautions of its own, precautions which could be misunderstood as preparations for an attack, and which might indeed in themselves ultimately provoke a response and a conflict and a war, which perhaps everybody would prefer not to see happen. So I consider these deployments very concerning developments indeed. I wonder what exactly is going on. It seems to me that the situation is becoming increasingly dangerous and increasingly threatening, and clearly my hopes expressed in my video yesterday that the crisis is abating, well, it's starting to look as if those hopes might have been a bit premature. Can I briefly touch on one other important thing? There's been a lot of comments recently about the Muslim summit that took place in Riyadh a couple of days ago. And a lot of people predictably have come forward and said that this was nothing more than a talking shop and nothing much was achieved there. I've already made my own views about this clear. I think that this view is simply and completely wrong. I go along instead with the assessment of Alistair Crook, who's recently written another piece in which he says that the events in Gaza have infuriated the entire Arab and Muslim world, and that they're starting to come together. All of these various countries and political leaders are starting to come together in a way that is contrary to the interests of Israel and of the United States. And there is a group photograph which I thought illustrated this point perfectly. Now, one of the big stories of the last year or so is this complicated dance between Bashar al-Assad and Recep Tayyip Erdogan over a possible summit meeting between the two. Erdogan wants this summit. Assad has been avoiding a summit with Erdogan. He wants concessions. And this has not yet happened. The Russians have spent a huge amount of time trying to broker the setting up of this summit, but so far it's not happened. Well, there they were in this group photograph following the meeting in Riyadh, and MBS, of course, was there. Raisi of Iran was also there. They're all there looking, presenting a united front, looking pleased and happy to be together. But there was Assad and Erdogan also. They too were there in this group photo, showing unity and solidarity with each other. It is not so long ago, a year, 2 years ago, when a photograph of this nature would have been unthinkable. Even a few months ago, it would have been difficult to imagine. And yet we see how this crisis has brought it about. And as I've also discussed in recent programs, this crisis has also resulted in the first of what the Chinese are already saying is likely to be a series of further Security Council resolutions. We're still starting to see that process play out as well. So I do not agree that this was a talking shop. I think this was an extremely consequential event. I think people misunderstand the dynamic of foreign policy in the Middle East. I think that announcing oil embargoes and military action on the part of the Muslim states would have played directly into the hands of the hardliners. I would suggest also that the very presence of Raisi in this group photograph makes it more difficult for the United States to launch its attack on Iran. We see that there is now Muslim solidarity, and it includes Iran as well. And the political effects of all of this will grow. Anyway, all of this continues even as the United States edges towards creating more problems for the world and ultimately for itself. I've discussed in previous programs the fact that the United States continues apparently on its plans to send more weapons supplies, crank up weapons supplies to Taiwan, despite repeated Chinese warnings about the enormous dangers of this and the fact that this is unacceptable to China. So that is one thing. But the United States now also seems to be meddling, and not just the United States, but the European Union as well, also seem to be meddling increasingly in the Southern Caucasus. They're now trying quite clearly to win over Armenia to their side. There's talk about the United States and France supplying weapons to Armenia to counter Azerbaijan. The Armenians are being lent on to close the Russian military base in Armenia and to engineer the removal of the Russian peacekeepers from Nagorno-Karabakh. Well, we've already had a response to all of this from Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan has said that they do not accept or approve of any of these steps, and an Azerbaijani official has even come forward and said that if this starts to happen, then it could actually provoke another war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Armenia has been consistently losing its recent wars with Azerbaijan ever since Prime Minister Pashinyan became Armenia's leader. It will not win if there is a further war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The only thing that at the moment prevents such a war taking place, the only guarantee that Armenia has that such a war will not take place, is that the Russians, who are physically present, are treaty bound to defend Armenia if such an attack takes place, so long as Armenia remains a member of the Collective Security Treaty Organization. And the presence of the Russian base and of the Russian peacekeepers provides the backstop. Armenia has now increasingly withdrawn itself from the operations of the Collective Security Treaty Organization. Pashinyan says that he does not yet intend, or does not intend, to withdraw from the Collective Security Treaty Organization, but he seems to be increasingly working towards making Armenia's participation in that organization less and less meaningful. It is an exercise in having one's cake and eat it, get the Russian guarantee, even as one shuffles Armenia into the hands of the West, which the Russians, of course, are fully aware of, and which they are not probably going to play along with, at least not for very much longer. So, it is an extremely dangerous game. It's an extremely dangerous game that Pashinyan is playing. It's an extremely dangerous game that France and the United States are playing. Long before Western support can reach Armenia, if it can reach Armenia at all, the Azerbaijani army, which now outnumbers Armenia and is far better equipped than Armenia's army, partly equipped, by the way, by Israel, is going to be able to push forward and achieve whatever objectives it has, like carving out the land corridor to Nakhichevan and perhaps doing other things. So this is a dangerous and a reckless game. One gets the sense that Prime Minister Pashinyan himself is out of his depth and does not fully understand the dangers that he is leading Armenia into. But the EU and the United States, which would be much wiser to stay out of this game altogether, seem unable to resist the temptation to meddle. And I have to say that I can't help but worry that Armenia could be facing a fate not so different from the one of Ukraine, led up the Primrose Path, as Professor Mearsheimer said of Ukraine, led along the Primrose Path, not perhaps to outright destruction. I still think that the Russians will never let that happen, but to a point of massive damage. Well, there we are. That's where I finish my program today. There'll be more from me soon. In the meantime, let me remind you that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop. Look up the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.